Blues in Michigan that came down and met us for lunch one day. And they all had fun. It was a lot of fun. I'd say that. Yeah, I talked to my brother today, and he said he went out and played golf and froze to death. It was raining and
So sad for him.
I know.
Our son is in West Virginia, right at the Pennsylvania border, and Morgantown. And I talked to him about it, and he said, "Oh, we're going to fall the leaves are changing." Oh yeah, that's right. I love that time we were.
Well, all along the way, we drove, and so all along the way, it was like getting ready to see the trees were all getting ready to change.
Well, I don't know where everybody is tonight, but I guess we've weeded them out or something.
I think it's the Monday night football effect.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
Either that or Dancing with the Stars.
The Steelers are playing the Buccaneers. Buccaneers are always about points.
There will be football years to go. I want, did anybody have something they want to start with tonight?
I found this from Reuben Job.
Okay.
It's one simple prayer.
Okay. I'm going to let you share that in a minute. I want to read, this is from Revelations of Divine Love by Dame Julian of Norwich. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. I could probably do that in about 5-10 minutes, but my voice probably won't keep it. But I'm just going to share a bit of the words, and this is Revelations of Divine Love is kind of a reflection of visions that she has. Revelations, you could call them visions, and they're states of altered consciousness that she's had when she these words come to her. It says, in this same time, our Lord shewed me, S-H-E-W-E-D, a spiritual sight of his homely loving. I saw that he is to us everything that is good and comfortable for us. He is our clothing, that for love wrappeth us, claspeth us, and also encloseth. Oh boy, that's what it is. Closeth us for tender love, that he may never leave us, being to us all things that is good as to mine understanding. Also in this he showed me a little thing, the quantity of an hazelnut in the palm of my hand, and it was as round as a ball. I looked thereupon with eye of my understanding and thought, what may this be? And it was answered generally thus, it is all that is made. And I marveled how it might last, for methought it might suddenly have fallen to naught for littleness. And I was answered in my understanding, it lasteth, and ever shall last, for that God loveth it. And so all things hath that being by the love of God. In this little thing I saw three properties. The first is that God made it. The second is that God loveth it. And the third, that God keepeth it. But what is to me verily the maker, the keeper, and the lover, I cannot tell. For till I am substantially owned to him, I may never have full rest, nor very bliss. That is to say, till I be so fastened to him, that there is right naught that is made betwixt my God and me. The wording is a little bit different, but again, her revelation, or how she understands things given to her. You want to share your prayer, and we will open.
This is from Reuben Job, who I'm sure some
He
of
was
you.
the editor of the Upper Room for a number of years.
It's a prayer. God of immeasurable love, incomprehensible compassion, unending goodness, unyielding justice, and mercy without end, come now to guide us, companion and sustain us as we seek only your will and grace to follow your direction. Save us from careless words, reckless judgments, unwilling hearts, and divisive acts. Save us for careful listening, gentle words, rigorous thought, loving actions, and faithfulness to your high calling. We have promised to love you and our neighbor with our entire being. By the power of your Spirit, grant us grace to live up to our promise. Thank you for your loving kindness, hearing our prayers, and accepting our lives as we offer them to you anew. In the name and the Spirit of our faithful Savior, Jesus Christ, to whom we belong. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Yeah, Reuben Job has written several things. He was, I guess, executive director of the Board of Discipleship for, I think that was his title, but Bishop Reuben Job, and one of our retired bishops. He wrote
Is it 3 simple words?
3 simple rules.
Rules, yeah.
Do anybody know what those 3 simple rules are?
Love your God with all your mind, all your heart, and all your...
Well, that was Jesus' greatest commandment, yeah. But Reuben Job wrote this little book, 3 Simple Rules, but it based off of John Wesley's statement of 3 simple rules.
What was it? Do no harm, do no good, and...
Do no harm, do good.
Do no harm, do good. Sorry, it was do no harm, do good, and always be in love with God.
Amen. Very good. Well done.
Well, I can't take any credit for it because that's what Tony said on Sunday.
Oh, you got prompted.
You remember. Yeah. That's true credit.
Yeah. That's the 3 simple rules. Do no harm, do good, stay in love with God. And I think that's important for us to understand tonight because the key, one of the key understandings from this chapter that we're looking at tonight is worship. And there was a line in the book that in your study guide that I really liked, and it's at the top of page 35. And it's not exactly at the top. It's the first line of the paragraph on the elders. And it says, the elders perform 3 actions in their worship that represent their inner posture of being. That word, inner posture of being, I think is a key phrase. I invite you to underline that because as we just kind of keep that in the back of the mind as we talk about worship and the other things tonight, because that really is what's at the heart of the worship. I want us to do a little exercise tonight as we get started. And I think I'm just going to kind of divide the class in 2. And if you're on the right, my right, if you're on my right, I would like for you to take a look at the passage from the 4th chapter, the 2nd through the 8th verses. And if you're on my left hand here, go to the 21st chapter and look at the verses 10 through 27. Now, if you've already answered that in your workbook, that was question number 2 in your workbook, but if you've already done that, fine, you're already ready to go. But let's take a little time, and I want you to go to one of those passages, and in a few moments we're going to talk about the structure of heaven as described in those 2 structure of heaven and New Jerusalem as described in those 2 passages. So I'll give you just a few moments to take a look at one of them. You don't have to do both of them. Just pick one and do it. Does anybody need a Bible? I can get one out here. Huh? You need one, Ramona? Oh, okay. Anybody else need one?
King James?
Huh?
Is it King James?
Should be. It's revised standard. It's not the new revised standard.
Okay.
It's revised standard.
Thank you, Ed.
St. Paul's hasn't moved into the 21st century yet.
Oh.
They haven't even moved into the 20th.
All right, Ed, you've been recorded.
That isn't the first time that I've said that.
In the spirit, there is a continuation of missionary experience. So we come to know his vision of it a long time. It wasn't just yes, it was contemporary. How do you say it? One follows the other in consecutive. Thank you.
Tell me some characteristics of heaven.
Precious stones.
What kind of precious stones? Carnelian?
Sapphire. Oh, sapphire.
Come on.
There was a rainbow that looked like emerald.
Amethyst, topaz.
Gold. What else is in? What else is described there for heaven?
It seems very loud. It talks about lightning and thunder.
Glass.
Clear.
Transparent as glass.
Yeah, that was involved.
Tell me about some of the furnishing.
There was a throne, surrounded by 24 thrones, evidently one special throne.
Get both of them in multiple
And
thrones.
on the 24 thrones were 24 elders in white garments and golden crowns.
So people wearing white, or we'll say beings wearing white.
There are 12 gates with pearls.
What was in front of the throne?
The glass, the sea glass.
Isn't there an altar first?
Clear as crystal. Oh, and an altar, yes.
And then there's the sea. Okay. What is God holding? Who's on the throne?
The lamb.
No, not on the
Huh?
God holding the scroll.
So God,
It just says he who was on the throne.
okay, capital H,
Nope,
huh?
not in this version.
Oh,
Someone sitting on it.
Golden scroll in his right hand.
no.
Yeah, put your finger on his right hand.
We're gonna talk about that. All right. And there is somebody else on the throne, but how is this other person on the throne?
Ask that again.
Sitting.
Oh, he who sat there,
Someone
but
sitting
didn't say
on
it.
it.
Okay. There's also,
One who's sat
okay. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself.
Is that the group of people that on the thrones that were from the faithful citizens of New Jerusalem? The
I
same.
didn't see anything about the
Okay.
scroll in his hand.
That's in chapter 5.
Oh, okay.
Am I jumping ahead? Well, with one seated on the throne, and the one seated there looks like Jasper and Cornelius, and around the throne is a rainbow that looks like an emerald. And then there's 24 thrones, and then there are 24 elders, and then they have robes and crowns, and the lightning and thunder,
Then there's a sea of,
sea of glass like crystal. And then there are around the throne and on each side of the throne 4 creatures. Okay. And the 4 creatures, what's distinguishing about the 4 creatures?
they're covered all over with eyes,
All over.
And they each had 6
around
wings.
and within, although how we see them within, I don't know.
They got eyes everywhere and they have wings, 6 wings, right?
Yep.
Okay, that's quite a bit of stuff. Those of you who looked at verse 21, tell me about New Jerusalem.
Well, it's a square city.
Square.
Cube.
Must be a board ship, huh?
Oh, that's
The holy city was coming down.
Foundation of precious stones.
And foundation of precious stones. Did it describe some of those stones?
Jasper, sapphire, agate.
Jasper, sapphire, agate, carnelian,
Pure gold.
onyx,
Onyx.
onyx, gold.
Beryl.
What?
Beryl.
Berryl?
Crystallite.
Crystallite, topaz.
Okay. So basically, that really looks an awful lot like this, huh? Okay, let's keep going. High walls or 12 gates. 12 gates,
Pearl.
high walls,
Angels at the gates.
angels at the gates.
the 12 days were 12 pearls.
And the gates were inscribed in the name of the Israelites.
But that's just how we saw it.
Now,
Street made of gold.
That's the only frame of reference.
streets of gold.
That's all it looked like. Yeah.
12 foundations.
So we got 12 gates, 12 foundations.
12 pearls. Street of gold. Transparent. Transparent gold.
Yeah, it's almost like my crystal thing.
Is there a throne?
No.
Throne, no temple.
Huh?
No.
No throne, no temple, because the land. No what is it? No throne and no temple in the whole city. Yes.
Don't need or
Something don't need it.
Why don't we need a throne?
It's the whole presence of the Lamb.
So the presence of God
Yes,
is
the throne.
throughout.
Fills it.
Okay. Well, that's good enough. But you see that there are some comparisons to that and the connections there. When you look at the questions or in the reading, what was in the reading? What did he say? The significance of the scroll being written on both sides and having 7 seals.
Sense of completeness.
It being there's a completeness of sealing it. I mean, with both being completeness of sealing it plus the completeness of there not being any more space to write on the scroll. And if you remember at the end of Revelation, it says you're not supposed to add anything to the vision. The connection is that this is a vision of God's purpose. And one of the things that we can add on to is God's purpose. And that's what the scroll represents. The scroll represents God's purposes for creation. And these 4 beings, 4 creatures, what did the author indicate that those 4 creatures represent? Those 4 creatures represent the whole of created order. One looks like one has a
Oh, right.
has the head of a lion. The other has
Nose of a lamb.
a lamb and a foot and it's
Eagle?
lion, ox, human, and eagle. So you got
Mammals.
I don't know how that represents, but that comes out of the Old Testament traditions of that representing those 4 creatures representing all of created order. I mean, I would, based upon our understanding of the created order, it would be probably be some fish and some reptiles and some other things in there. But this is.
The Old Testament.
But in any case, those 4 beings are symbolic of the created order and the purposes of God associated with that. And this idea that this is the scroll representing God's purposes, but it's not just a thought. What is the significance of right hand? Did anybody look up and see what that is? Action. So it's not that just God has a purpose planned. It's that God is working that plan primarily. And that plan was, as we get further on in chapter 5, we realize that there's a problem getting to look in that scroll, that no one can open the scroll except one is found, who is the Lamb of God, Jesus. And I had an interesting thought as I was reading this. We could probably say that, well, Jesus, because he was the Son of God, and because of his purity, and because of those connections, he is able then to open the scroll. But the reality is, when did the scroll get opened?
Before the beginning of time?
Before the beginning of time, because, and definitely through the life and resurrection of Jesus on earth. Because Jesus was the one who could make God's purposes and plans and purposes real to us in living it out in our space and time.
Well, we know that Jesus was present with God at the creation.
At the beginning of
Okay,
time.
and the whole thing about being the Son of God, that only refers to the incarnation life of Jesus.
Right.
So Jesus has a life before the incarnation, then life on earth, then has a life after. So in a way, thinking of Jesus as the Son of God is very limiting.
It
For a
is.
small period of time. That's not really what he is in my view, but is the same thing as God, just
Right.
a different aspect somehow of God.
A personage.
Yes,
in
that
the
God was
Greek
able
terms.
to send a little part of his spirit down and become a human being, but that was just a very temporary thing.
But it was that I guess as I picked from the reading, and again, this was just a thought that hit me, that is the purpose, everything that was in the scroll is wrapped up in what Jesus did on earth. He played, in other words, he acted out, he became God's right hand on earth. He became the action of God's purpose among us. That helped me understand why the vision indicates he's the one to open the scroll. Yeah.
I must have missed something. Where does it indicate that the scroll was opened before the beginning of time?
It's not necessarily here in this, but the reality is that if Jesus is the one to open the scroll, and the scroll represents God's purpose is there from the beginning, and Jesus was the one who was opening that scroll to all creation. I mean, that's how I'm reasoning out what I'm understanding that the vision is trying to tell us. In other words, it's what we're looking at here is not what we're looking at in the vision. We have to get out of the mindset that the vision is looking necessarily just in the future. The vision is
Outside of time. It's outside of time.
outside of time. It's beyond time, but it goes, as we look at it, it goes to our past as well as to the present as well as to the future. So it encompasses all of that. And so therefore, if Jesus is involved and Jesus is the one who becomes God's right hand and to open the scroll, then that just kind of follows in terms of my thinking.
I think it's like John is getting a vision in a way from God's viewpoint where he's able to look at, here's creation and here's whatever, something. And, we're going along, in a linear fashion, but God is looking at it in a particular way and seeing the whole thing at once. And so John gets that vantage point in those moments of the vision to see kind of from God's viewpoint the whole thing at once.
Yep. That's the difficulty about I guess it's the beauty of the vision, but it's also the difficulty of us trying to understand it based upon written word and language.
We can't understand it in terms of, linear time, like
Right.
people are trying to say, well, this happens after such and such. No,
Yeah.
No, it's the whole thing all the
Right.
time at once, experienced in an instant. So we can't really comprehend that in any rational way.
So the vision, we started out in the chapters 1 through 3, looking at addressing the church, those 7 churches, the church as it was at that point in time. And now we're looking at what heaven is and was at a particular point in time, as it's described in the vision. And the way the author looks at it, he says John's vision began by addressing the church. This is right at the beginning of this chapter. And what is to take place after this, the profound reality is in which the church is involved and the citizens of New Jerusalem fall back. And then everything goes after this, and we all of a sudden jump into a deeper dynamic of heaven. John starts out in chapter 4 again, reminding us that he's in the Spirit, reminding us that the vision continues, that it's not a new vision, he's continuing in the Spirit, he's in the altered state of consciousness, whatever that is that allows him to have this vision. This isn't a new vision. I mean, you don't have the vision of the 7 churches and then have the vision of a deeper heaven. It's all one vision. And
I think I only describe one thing at a time.
yeah, he can only talk about one thing at a time. And he's better than most of us. Some of us can't even do that. So, but also to remember that some of the jewels that are described that we wrote about here are jewels from the breastplate of priests in the Old Testament. So that again, that tie to the Old Testament. An interesting point that he wants us to remember, even as we continue on through, is here on page 34 in your study guide. He said, white robes are closely associated with the redeemed people of God. They represent the essential being of those who have been conformed to the image of Christ. In the rest of the vision, no heavenly being is clothed in white, only the redeemed. In terms of being clothed in white. Now, white will be used to, when we get to chapter next, we get to session 5 and 6, we will see that there's, we'll be looking at the colors. Colors are going to show up again in terms of that. Throughout this, what is really taking place? What is taking place in all of this? I mean, we talk about, we have the 24 elders, we have the 4 creatures, we have other beings.
The trumpet is going all this time.
What is happening? I heard the word
Worship.
Worship is taking place. Worship is taking place. And what is the key element of the worship that we're seeing shared there? Is it just acknowledging? Is worship just acknowledging God?
Their attitude, you talked about their inward posture, it's
Right.
their attitude that is engraved, it's the real them.
Can I acknowledge that God exists without having an attitude of worship?
Oh, sure, that's what Satan does.
I like what he says in this one sentence where he said, worship of God is not merely an outward observance, but a deep inner orientation of being by which God is enthroned in the totality of one's life.
Yeah, isn't that neat? It's a good word. Yeah, I mean, in good sense. The fact is, it's about our inner. How have we placed Christ or God in our lives? Where is that? There's been a lot of metaphors used, I think, over the years. One, I think, even Jesus used the metaphor of a man who, cleared out all the what am I trying to say? All the devils out of his life. He gets all his devils, but if he doesn't fill that space within his inner being, more devils come and get there. So that idea is that our inner being is a place where God needs to fill that space. Some people have called it our God void or whatever, that God-shaped void in our lives, that we need that. But it's that aspect of having God in our lives is, I think, central to the idea that what are the elders doing? First of all, they're kneeling, right? But that's not the biggest thing that they do. They cast their crowns. And what does the author tell us? That action, what does that represent?
Yielding one's life to God's control.
Turning it all over. We're taking our control over our own life and giving it to God. We're saying, and so here's the real crazy thing. It says, God, you have control over all my resources. I give you control over my pocketbook. That's probably the hardest thing we in this country have to give God is our pocketbook.
We say that after offering, everything we have is what He's given us.
Well, it is. I mean, that's the truth of it. But we want to keep it. We don't want to give it back. We don't want to allow Him to use the resources that God has given us to try to accomplish God's purposes. And I think this is the biggest argument that I have with people who have great inordinate wealth, is that they have chosen to keep control over that and not give God the total use of that.
Yeah.
Because I have a feeling God would use it a lot differently than many people are using it. But that's probably one of the other things. What are some of the other things that we have a hard time turning loose of, turning control over?
Our time.
Time. Yeah, we don't. And I'd have to say this from the perspective of a pastor and a retired pastor at this point in time, that I know of 3 or 4 ministries that probably are not going to go ahead, and they're valuable ministries that are not going to go ahead simply because we do not have pastoral support. I'm not talking about our pastor, I'm just talking about in general. It's not just United Methodist pastors, but we don't have I know that Kairos Outside had a hard time finding pastors to serve on their weekend they just had. But we have a Kairos weekend for prison ministry down in Wilmot, and we don't have any clergy to serve on the team, and they generally have for every two lay team members, there should be a clergy member. So there's some other activities that we need support for. So it's not just lay people that are have a hard time giving up time, that even our clergy are having a hard time giving up time and that sort of thing. And
Well, also, is there possibly, there's a shortage?
there is a shortage of clergy at this point in time, in all denominations, basically. So,
Yeah.
But that's that is time related. Other resources involved as well. It's not real cheap to go to seminary. Tony was telling me a story today in a couple of his churches. He had young people that were very gifted and were feeling like Jesus was calling them into the ministry, and after he sat down and told them what the path would be for them to go into ordained ministry, he said it seemed like Jesus stopped talking to them. There are a lot of roadblocks, a lot of obstacles in terms of getting into ministry. So that's maybe we're not fulfilling. Maybe the church isn't fulfilling the purpose that God intends for us in that. How do you, when you think of worship, where do you think of worship taking place?
No, most people think of it taking place at church in a building.
Yeah, in a building.
I think many of us do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But where I sense that you guys have already caught on that worship occurs all the time. That it is worship is in how we live out our lives. Worship occurs in the decisions that we make on a daily, moment by moment basis, and that's this idea. I think is really key. That as he describes it, the idea of the purposes of God and the right hand, the understanding that God is a God of action. It's not just something that is passive. God is an active God to have God's purposes fulfilled. Now, and the remarkable thing, I think, that the Wesleyan movement helped to elevate was that God allowed us the freedom to be a part of it, and that we can choose to get on board with God's purposes, and God offers us that freedom. And I think we'll get more deeply into that theology as we go in our next session. But we have an opportunity to be part of God's right hand in doing it. I think sometimes we think that worship is just singing songs and praying, and that's a part of it. That's part of it. I think it's a neat part of it. But one of the things that some churches started here not too long ago, which I thought was helped us think outside the box a little bit, was we started what's called workship. And so on Sunday morning you come in your work clothes and you go maybe clean somebody's yard up who can't do yard work, or you go to a homeless shelter and you feed somebody, or you do some kind of action on Sunday morning to honor and to glorify God, to show that it's not just a work of our voice, it's a work of our hands and our whole whole being, all the resources that we have. And I felt like that was you don't do it every Sunday, but to do that 4 or 5 times a year to remind you that real worship begins when you walk out of the door. After you have worship, the real worship then begins as you enter daily life to do God's purpose.
Well, all these, there's a question that a Jewish atheist, put to me many years ago, a doctor of social work that was a friend of mine. He was very familiar with the Bible. And, especially all these images of the 4 creatures all worshiping God and throwing their crowns and everybody's bowing down. Do we really think that it's not God that needs that? God doesn't possibly need to see all these people bowing and scraping and throwing crowns at him. What need could God possibly have, we think in terms of human need, for such things? Obviously God doesn't need that. So it must be that we need, that's what we need.
I think we need, but I also think it goes to that God has created a freedom in which we have a role to play in all of creation. As we said, these beings, these 4 creatures represent all of creation, and God has allowed us an opportunity to be involved in creation. He's given us the ability to be part of creation, to make decisions associated with the well-being of creation, to try to further God's purposes. And as I have read it, I think we'll get there, and maybe I'm jumping ahead a bit. God's purpose really is shalom. And we think of shalom as being just peace. Well, the wind's not blowing, or we're not fighting one another. Then we must be at peace. But shalom is much deeper than that, and shalom involves all of creation. It doesn't just involve human beings. Human beings affect shalom, mostly negatively, it appears, in my lifetime anyway. But when we talk of what is God's purposes here, God's purposes is one of shalom. Create. What did the writers of Genesis, when they describe in the second creation story, what is when I mention the word Garden of Eden, what kind of images do you have of that?
An apple tree.
An apple tree, okay, but
An apple tree.
okay.
Paradise.
Paradise, okay. So shalom is part of paradise. Paradise, it would mean that the animals and the beings and the creatures and everything that's in that garden are in harmony in some way. That there is
conflict.
Shalom. Lack of conflict, but it's even deeper than lack of conflict. It's more like we're really all working together. We're symbiotic, so to speak, in the fact that it amazes me today our inner systems, our digestive tract, to be a little more specific. Our digestive tract is inhabited by all kinds of flora and fauna. We are a veritable zoo on our insides, and when those beings are not working together properly, we don't feel good. And you could kind of use that same imagery to think of when everything's working together, that's shalom. Unfortunately, you had a comment, George. Has it been too long and you forgot about it?
Yeah. Somebody else used the word.
Okay.
Well, I have one before we go too much farther. At the top of page 35, the Lamb with the 7 eyes that are the 7 spirits of God. What the heck can that represent?
You're on page 35.
At the top, line 4, the end. Oh, line 3. At the end of line 3. At the top.
Well, the idea of the later description of he's talking about a description that occurs in chapter 5, verse 6. That whenever you see the word 7, what's that reference?
Totality.
Totality, yeah, all of it. So, in essence, the 7 spirits would be, the totality of God's presence, basically. That God's presence is everywhere. And he talks, it's kind of the same thing. He's using that to amplify, I think, what he said above, is that the fullness of the eyes, doubly noted, seems to represent the omniscience and the omnipresence of God. Which basically is the same thing as being said with the use of the term 7 spirits, is the omnipresence of God.
Where did that derive from? Where did we learn that? The 7 represents totality.
That's Jewish tradition, I guess, Jewish symbology. If you went online and well, it's not just symbology, it's numerology. If you went online and you said Hebrew or Jewish numerology, you would see a list of what, 3 has a significance, 2 has a significance because it's the absence of 1 and 3. 6, you've heard the terms, the beast has the title 666. Well, that's first of all, 3, which is a totality or a completeness, and then the absence of 1 makes something totally bad. So if it was 777, it would be totally good, but because it's 666, it's totally bad. So that's part of the numerology, and it's Hebrew. And it probably even goes back deeper than that, but in its Old Testament, you could probably find that in Daniel to a certain degree. You can find it in Isaiah somewhat, in their imagery and numerology. But if you search online and just search for Hebrew or Jewish numerology, you'll get a list of all of that.
Like 40 days and 40 nights.
Yeah.
And 144, the 12 tribes of Israel squared.
40 is just a long time, whether it's 40 seconds or whether it's 40 minutes or 40 years. It's a long time. And so it's not chronological, it's kairos. It's kairos time. Not literal in that aspect. Jesus is 40 days in the wilderness. He was in the wilderness a long time, and he got really hungry. So that's the 40 representation.
Can I lend a joke?
Sure.
You know why the Hebrews were 40 you know,
40 days.
years out in the desert trying to find the promised land?
Go ahead.
They were men and they wouldn't ask
For directions.
They had a full tank of gas.
You can do a lot of circles on a full tank of gas. Well, and see the other I guess use of 40 is it's as long as it takes. And so the 40 years in the wilderness, it's as long as it took for them to be ready to go into the promised land. And so it took them that long to be ready to do what God was calling them to do, or what God was calling them to become. So that 40 has, could be a long time, but it also is, again, the Kairos time. It's as long as it takes to complete God's purpose. And again, when we talk about worship, we're tied into purpose and action and free will and all of it. So, other points. Keep me from talking here. Come on, please. Just to reiterate, on page 36 under the scroll, much of what I'm sharing with you is in that little paragraph there. So much attention is usually given to the scroll that its location is almost totally overlooked. Significantly, the scroll is in the right hand of God. The right hand of God is an image of the action of God and the fulfillment of God's purposes. We see one of the things that a lot of times in our prayers and in our liturgy, Jesus is seated at the right hand of God. He's seated at the right hand of God because he is God's action guide. He's seated at the right hand because we sometimes put a good and bad connotation to that, but I don't think that does it total justice. I think he's got the point here that this image suggests that the scroll in God's right hand has something to do with the purposes God enacts. It's not just the purposes that he hopes will occur, it's the purposes that God enacts. E-N-A-C-T-S. What he does. He's a Nike guy. He just does it.
And he's not even a guy.
You're right.
Spirit that has no gender.
No gender. Since the opening of the scroll discloses the fullness of God's action with respect to both the rebellious and the redeemed orders of life, the scroll represents the totality of the purpose of the Creator in response to the rebellion of the creation. This representation is why no one in the created order, neither in heaven or on earth or under earth, was able to open the scroll or to look into it. God's purpose rises above the created order. It is not to be found in the dynamics of the created order, but within the nature of God. Only the Lamb is able to open the scroll because the Lamb is at the very center of God's purpose. It's almost as if Jesus and the scroll, if you want to use a Zen term, Jesus and the scroll are one. They're very closely associated with one another. I think another part of our understanding of worship so much of worship today is about making God our generals so that we can go out and do battle with fallen Babylon. And even movies like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the Narnia series, which good children's stuff, but bad theology. Not total bad theology, but the fact that the children participate in the battle against bad witch is not what we're going to see in the book of Revelation, because Jesus is the one who has conquered. Jesus is the conqueror, the one that addresses fallen Babylon and addresses fallen Babylon through the gospel. The gospel is the sword that is in Jesus' mouth. Again, I'm getting ahead, but it's hard to talk about Revelation and talk about this vision without looking at the whole book of Revelation. Looking at it chapter to chapter is sometimes a little difficult. But our Savior, the one that we glorify and bow down to, we cast our crowns around the throne, but that also incorporates Jesus, the Lamb. And what is it about a lamb that is so different than what we honor in our world?
Gentle, non-combative.
Gentle, non-combative,
Mild.
almost defenseless.
His God is our shepherd, or Jesus is our shepherd. He cares
Right.
for us. We use that analogy.
But that's the analogy, but do we really buy into that? See, I guess my point is that when I saw a metaphor, a mega church back in some other part of the United States. They were getting ready to do a fund campaign to build a building. And the pastor had a very unique message. He had on stage in his preaching, he had a ladder. And his idea was, he started giving his message. He stepped up on the ladder a few rungs. But then when he got to the heart of his message was moving down. Going down. Not elevating ourselves, but elevating God. Lifting others up by us lowering ourselves. And I think one of the places where the Christian church has co-opted with fallen Babylon, with our society, is we want power. We want the church to have power. We want to have power. And that's not our role to have. There's only one, when we speak of the church, there's only one place that power stands. Where is that? With God. Exactly. And so, when we have to be very careful, I think, in terms of our worship, is that we're not asking God to come give us the power to overcome. We may want God to give us the ability and the grace to overcome the world via His Word, His Gospel, His peace, His shalom. And so, I invite you, that's one of the reasons why Onward Christian Soldiers is not one of my first choices. Because I think it lifts us up into a place of power. Now, again, grant him, and I'm sure that it has honored God in ways, but we need to be conscious of that in our worship. That we're not elevating ourselves, nor asking God to elevate ourselves. That we need to be about that. Part of that casting crowns down is casting power down. We talked about pocketbooks being hard to give up. One of the other things that's hard to give up is our power, our authority over someone, and that's very difficult for, I think, in our culture, not necessarily in other cultures, and more difficult for men probably than for women. There's places where women really do need to understand that they do have power, that God does empower them in ways, and but so it does have some gender-specific terms. But power is one of the things that we need to turn over to God. Generally, when we have power, what do we do with it? Abuse it.
Want more.
Exactly. We want more. Oh,
I wanted to mention that I always, one thing that I love to acknowledge is stunning paradox that is not understandable from a human viewpoint is that Jesus is both the lamb and the shepherd.
yes. Yeah.
Yep.
Both.
He's also
He's the
both
sac-
lamb and a lion.
And the Lion of Judah.
You can't really understand that. How
Yeah, that's
the
right.
lamb be the shepherd?
Yeah,
You know, just doesn't make sense.
That's why I chuckle when somebody tells me they've got their faith all figured out.
They have the what on
Their
their
faith.
When they have their faith all figured out, I chuckle a little bit because there are so many paradoxes that we have to try to understand, but know that in many cases they're beyond us.
But isn't that what faith is? Just
Oh, that.
that you don't know.
Please, Lord. Please, Lord. That's right.
This exists.
If we didn't have questions, it would be assurance. And but our assurance is in the God that loves us, and the God who has called us forward. I think our faith comes in trying to figure out where we fit into this purpose right here. Becomes one of our difficult choices. And I think we've already hit on it, but it's always worth hitting it again, that the praise and worship of God is the structure in which God is enthroned. We should also begin to understand that the worship of God is not merely an outward observance, but a deep inner orientation of being by which God is enthroned in the totality of one's life. And so when we talk about it, God is enthroned in the totality of each of our individual lives, that we should think of it in the same way when we talk about our church. God needs to be the one that is enthroned by our church. I mean, that needs to be our focus of worship, the totality. Worship of God takes place in the presence of the realm of. Again, what was the problem with Ephesus?
They were very
They lost their first.
satisfied. They were,
They thought they were doing everything right. What had they done to the community around them? They closed them out. They had shut themselves off from that. So they really weren't worshiping in the midst of their culture. They had created their own little isolation so that they didn't have to deal with what God calls us. But our worship actually is to take place in the presence of the realm of the rebellion. and the quality of worship determines one's citizenship. So we can't ignore the culture in which we come out of. One of the courses that was taught at seminary when I went through was the enculturation of Christianity, and how the Christianity we've received over the centuries has gone from one culture to another culture to another culture to another culture, and is adapted. Every time Christianity goes into a new culture, it in some way becomes slightly enculturated, maybe sometimes more than just slightly. So you cannot separate our faith from the culture. We're tied up in that. But what helps our worship is to keep God on the throne of our lives.
How do you reconcile that with the complaints against the Church of Laodicea?
Well, Laodicea had basically, they had gone all the way over to the cultural side, and they had forgot to keep their heart in God's realm.
What do you mean by it's necessary to enculturate?
Well, let me see if I can. When you go, let's say, when the missionaries from our when the missionaries from the United States goes to Africa, and they begin to tell the story. First of all, well, let me back up. What did Paul do? What did Paul do when he went to Athens?
He told him about the unknown God.
Right. He walked through the agora, the center of town, and he looked and he saw what it was, what their culture was like, who it was that they worshipped, and they were. And he said, "You are a very religious people." You know, he acknowledged their bent to be sure that they were worshiping God. He said, "Now let me tell you about the real God." But he used their culture and their understanding of God and worship as he told them the gospel.
And he tuned the message to their culture.
He tuned the message to their culture. You use the metaphors from their culture to describe. You use the symbols from their culture to describe. But the heart and purpose of God has to stay the same. We love one another. The great commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. And love your neighbor as yourself. See, that's the gospel. That has to stay. How we play that out is affected by the culture. But that's our values. The values is that we care for one another. If the cultural values are that we take care of ourselves, we let them take care of themselves. We don't have any responsibility. If that's the cultural value, then now we have a conflict between the Christian value and the cultural value. What I'm saying in Laodicea is they allowed the cultural value to have reign over the Christian value that they have, and that's what it. You know, maybe the Laodicean church said it's okay for us to have power and wealth. It sounds to me like what Jesus was describing in Laodicea was that they were quite wealthy. They they lived along a trade route, two trade routes, that they had they had some mills that did fine cloth that made people very rich, and then they basically wanted all of the fine stuff that the culture around said should have, instead of taking care of the poor, instead of taking care of the disadvantaged, instead of taking care of those that Jesus called them to take care of. So they bought into the values of the culture instead of the values of the gospel. Anybody got? That's my way of saying it.
It reminds me of the story, I think somewhere in Africa, when they tell the story, when trying to describe the love of the father for his child, would he give his child a snake? Well, in some cultures, a snake is a good thing to have.
Yeah.
So they have to put something that
Yeah.
is negative in place of the snake in certain cultures.
Yeah, you have to use and I think we understand today that there was much among our native peoples' cultures in this country that was very much in harmony and in tune with the gospel, but we failed to see it and understand it, and we wanted them to adapt our culture as much as we wanted them to adapt the faith in the gospel. And so,
Most of all, we wanted to take their land away.
Yeah, that was mainly what we wanted.
it's the power thing.
And greed.
Yeah, that we could go down the road a long way there. But I think are there any other comments associated with the worship? I put over here some papers that I will put these out in an email, but since I have plenty of copies, I will share the hard copies. These are additional helps, which is just additional things for you to read when you have all this time. As I realize. The top sheet basically talks about, I put this on the board the other day and then we didn't have a chance to talk about it. It talks about the structure of Revelation as Dr. Mulholland understands it. And so, as he says, there's very little agreement today on what the structure is, but this is what he sees in terms of the structure of the book of Revelation and how he sees at the heart of Revelation is chapters 11 through 15, where he says the big picture. That's the heart of the story. And then the leader's guide that I have at the end of each one of the sessions has what's called a additional Bible helps, and that's what I printed out. The page 23 has some additional Bible helps for the lesson tonight, and then the next two pages have additional Bible helps for chapters 5 and 6, which is next week's study. So, again, it's not mandatory reading, but if you have some questions or something you're reading, you might want to look at this, and it may give you some additional explanation that you don't have in your workbook. So, That's, I'm just sharing what I have available in this. New understanding? Yes.
I just want to say that one of the things I find the hardest to get straight is they use the number like 7 churches and 7 trumpets and 7 seals and 7 bowls, and they mean different things. That's why I'm getting confused. I mean, you know, I'm thinking 7 churches and there were 7.
Well, again,
that's
it's
the hardest thing for me.
the bowls are generally woes. Woes, generally.
W-O-E-S.
Hurts, pains,
Difficult.
agony, the difficulties. Generally, that's what the bowls are. But, and then the 7 trumpets.
7 seals.
You know, we talked about the 7 seals tonight, and that'll be more fully explained. But it's that the 7 seals on the scroll are to show that nothing can be added or subtracted from it. I mean,
No room to add anything.
well, there's also the fact that the scroll is written on both sides. But scrolls are never written on both sides; they're only written on one, so that the ink doesn't fade. But this scroll is written on both sides and has 7 seals on it, which means you can't get into it and you can't add anything. It's locked. Now, it's locked to us. It isn't locked to God. So that's the key element. Again, the idea of 7 is there is a completeness. When we get into the 7 trumpets and then the 7 bowls, it gets really messy, and what we'll try to do next week is just try to hit some high points that may clear things up a bit. I look at what you're going to read in chapters 6, basically 6 through 11, I think is, and it's not a lot of reading, but what you're going to see, I believe, as your workbook will, I think, describe, you're not seeing what's going to happen. You're seeing what is happening through fallen Babylon, which God allows because of God's free will. So, if in the free will system that we as Wesleyans understand, God doesn't need our worship. God wants our worship. God wants our love. God wants us to be in line with God's purposes, so that all of the stuff that we see happening under these 7 trumpets, 7 riders, all of these things, if we were in harmony with God's purpose, in other words, if all of creation was living in New Jerusalem, we wouldn't have those things. But God has allowed free will, which means that some people have the freedom to ignore and to do their own thing and not go to see God's purposes.
I think the reason, that God wants the worship, our worship and so forth, is so that we won't have to suffer.
Right. Very good. Well said. That's exactly the point. That if we are in harmony with God's purpose, suffering will cease. Shalom. The absence of suffering. So, when you're reading, I think when you're reading these next few verses, don't read it as if this is stuff that's going to happen. Think about in your mind how this is happening today and how it's what in our world and what in the culture that we call following God, but what is behind that. And I think it makes a lot more sense when we think of it that way. And it, you know, we can say, that's right. That's what happens, you know, when we build more military and more guns and we create weapons that, you know, will destroy. You know, we look in here and we say, well, a third of the world has been destroyed. Yeah, we're doing it right now in South America and in Africa and in other places. I think it's more reasonable when we read some of this as present tense more so than something future. That's how it seems to me as I was reading through it recently. So, okay. Would anybody like to close this with a prayer? I'm going to let you out 5 minutes late tonight. Isn't that crazy? Somebody want to close this with a prayer? Come on, Ramona, you can pray us out. Thank you.
Never pass up an opportunity. Precious Lord, we're so grateful to be here tonight, to delve into your word and to try to get better insight into why our world is the way it is and how you would like us to help it do better. Precious Lord, keep us this week, bring us all back safely, and help us to look for ways to help somebody every day this week, God. In Jesus' name we ask it. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Ramona. Thank you all. And I know Donna Magnus wasn't here tonight. She evidently ate something or something. She didn't sleep last night and was having a rough day, so and that's why she isn't there. And I think keep Becky Coward in your prayers with her granddaughter. I haven't heard any further word than what